Margaret woke up feeling disoriented on multiple levels. Not only was she clueless about her surroundings, but she also couldn't recall any recent memories. She attempted to open her eyes but quickly squeezed them shut again as the harsh brightness stung. It wasn't her sight but her sense of smell that gave her the first clue. The unmistakable sterile odor told her she was in a hospital. That solved one mystery, but her confusion remained intact. With her sense of smell satisfied, her ears took over. She recognized the familiar tune playing in the background. It was the theme of the nightly 7 news. A small comfort washed over her as she realized she never missed that broadcast at home. It had become missed that broadcast at home, a ritual she and her husband always shared. Husband. Yes, she had a husband. Even in her foggy state, she found it strange that whenever she tried to call his name, her mind seemed to slide away from it. Like water rolling off a duck's back or a polished diamond. The name just wouldn't stick. After much mental effort, the name finally surfaced. Richard, but the second it appeared, her mind rejected it, almost as if it were too hot to hold on to. Desperate for a distraction, she focused on the sound that had roused her. The music was gone now, replaced by the droning voice of the newsreader. She forced her eyes open for a brief moment, just long enough to confirm the presence of a television mounted on the wall. Then she concentrated on the broadcast. We have received a DVD of his statement, the newsreader announced. However, for legal reasons, we cannot air it. We can, however, share excerpts from the transcript. A warning. Some of what follows might not be suitable for younger viewers. Margaret's breath hitched as the reading began. To my darling wife. The voice read, I hope my actions today answer the questions you asked me 3 weeks ago. Can we move past this? Can you forgive me? My answer is a definitive no to both. Let me clarify the financial situation. To make things simple, I have canceled our car and medical insurance, paid off the credit cards, and closed them all. I've established a trust that is now the beneficiary of my life insurance policy, with my lawyer acting as the trustee. Every penny from our bank accounts has been added to this trust. Once everything is finalized, the trustee will distribute the funds to a few nominated charities. Yes, this means our children will inherit nothing, but they've finished their education, and I've given them the best start I could. My conscience is clear. I've written to each of them explaining my actions and begging their forgiveness. I spared them none of the brutal details and urged them to see your behavior as a cautionary tale, a lesson in why respect for loved ones matters. Wish I could be around to witness how your life unfolds from here. How will you explain this to our children, to our friends, and to their families? But as you've likely realized, that won't be possible. For the record, my decision has nothing to do with depression. In fact, anyone examining my actions will see they are the result of a logical and sound mind. Not that I didn't have reasons to be driven to the brink. Catching your wife in bed with another man is bad enough. But when she tells you to leave so they can continue, that could push even the strongest man over the edge. By now, Margaret couldn't deny the words were aimed squarely at her. The shock forced her to retreat inward, but her mind betrayed her with vivid flashes of the event itself. That fateful evening, Richard had been scheduled for an afternoon shift at the mine when the shaft hoist broke, making work underground impossible. He unexpectedly showed up at the monthly party of their close-knit friend group. Margaret remembered how the group of 9 couples had spent years together, sharing milestones. Most were either childless or recent empty nesters. That month, Vanessa and Thomas had hosted the gathering. Richard's first question upon arriving was about her whereabouts, so some genuinely didn't know, while others gave half-hearted excuses. Vanessa tried to deflect, but it was Stephen who slipped up. His inability to lie convincingly gave it away. When Richard noticed Stephen's nervous glance toward the stairs, he didn't hesitate. Despite several attempts to stop him, he climbed to the 2nd floor. What he found at the top was unforgettable. He flung the bedroom door open to see Thomas entwined with Margaret. Margaret caught sight of Richard over Thomas's shoulder. Her initial reaction wasn't one of guilt or remorse. Instead, she closed her eyes, focusing on her own goal. She had been holding off her peak, determined to achieve something she and Thomas had never managed: a simultaneous climax. It was a petty, ludicrous ambition, but at that moment it consumed her. When she finally gasped, Go away. Her voice wasn't filled with shame. It was the irritated plea of someone distracted by an unwanted interruption. But whatever she had hoped to salvage was lost. The moment was ruined. Thomas had been completely oblivious to what had transpired until long after he had finished. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, and in growing panic, he joined Margaret in haste. Getting dressed together, they raced out to find Richard. But he was already gone. With that particular memory fading, Margaret's attention unwillingly snapped back to the television. Broadcast continued, and the voice dripped with contempt as it read the next part of Richard's message to the media. I have a suggestion. Take this opportunity to perform a public service. Follow my ex-wife and the others involved in this fiasco for years, documenting the long-term consequences of their actions. If their lives turn out to be as pitiful and brutal as I expect, it might serve as a lasting reminder of what disrespect toward loved ones can lead to. Unless, of course, the pathetic scum takes the easy way out. Though I doubt she'd do that. Surely even she can understand how devastating it would be for the kids to lose both parents. Richard's words grew sharper as they shifted focus. Maybe the media could also produce a show exploring the socially acceptable way to end a marriage. As a counterpoint for those making the laws in this country, no-fault divorces might have seemed like a good idea at the time. But now we have the data to evaluate the consequences of both the old and new system. Isn't it time for an independent review to determine the most logical path forward, whether that's sticking with the current rules, returning to the old ways, or forging a new system entirely? The voice paused before delivering another blow. Here's a suggestion, off the cuff. Keep no-fault divorces for couples with dependent children, but revert to the old system for everyone else. Reinstate a framework where cheaters face consequences. All no-fault divorces have done is create an environment where, if the primary caregiver destroys their spouse's love and trust, they often walk away with no punishment or worse, a reward. That's exactly what it felt like when my lawyer told me I'd lose more than half my assets as a reward for my lifetime of fidelity and a career spent risking my health and safety to provide a comfortable life for a woman who betrayed me. The next part stung with venom. One request: for those in power, keep the process free from interference by certain radical groups. I'm talking about those militant activists with their agendas, steadily chipping away at fairness in relationships and law. And while you're at it, exclude the so-called modern men who pander to these movements. If we continue to allow hormones in our food supply unchecked, don't be surprised when gender confusion and societal chaos follow. Margaret's mind frantically searched for an escape from the diatribe, pulling her back into her own memories. After that disastrous night, Richard had vanished for several days, leaving her and Thomas scrambling to locate him. She hadn't felt guilt over her actions. Why should she? To her, everything had been perfectly justifiable. Sure, she regretted how Richard had found out, but that wasn't her fault. When Richard finally reappeared, she had braced herself for an explosive confrontation, fully expecting to endure his fury. Instead, what she saw shocked her. He returned as a shell of himself, hollow and lifeless. The sight unnerved her, but she used the 4 days of his absence to carefully construct her defense. She launched into it with confidence, explaining how Vanessa's health issues 3 years prior had left Thomas struggling in their marriage. Vanessa's challenges had diminished their intimacy, and as a friend, Margaret had felt obligated to help Thomas. She stepped in to support him. Couldn't Richard see she had been acting out of duty and kindness? Besides, she'd always made sure Richard's needs weren't neglected, even if that sometimes meant he got seconds on days she was with Thomas. She had even made it a point to avoid letting Richard engage in certain intimate acts on those days, to maintain some semblance of respect. Wasn't that thoughtful of her? Margaret painted her actions as noble, highlighting how discreet she had been throughout the affair. Only 3 other couples in their friend group knew about it, and she had sworn them all to secrecy. With a proud smile, she had told Richard, "I spared you the embarrassment. You wouldn't want everyone thinking your wife was unfaithful, would you?" She had tried to justify everything, even her shocking reaction when Richard caught her with Thomas. With 4 days to reflect, she had convinced herself that saying, "Go away," had simply been an unfortunate choice of words, born out of being caught up in the moment. She had even turned the tables on Richard, asking him to imagine being in Thomas's shoes. Wouldn't he have been upset if his excitement had been ruined like that? Margaret quickly realized that Richard wasn't impressed by her explanations. In fact, he didn't react at all. It was during this unsettling silence that she first felt a flicker of remorse. She asked him to forgive her and hoped they could move past everything. In her mind, it was only a matter of time and patience before things returned to normal. Over the next 3 weeks, she made a point of giving him space to process everything in his own time. They never spoke of the incident again, and she was relieved to see him almost back to his usual self, except for the peculiar, vacant look in his eyes. Looking back, it was as if some vital spark inside him had been extinguished, although he barely spent time with her. Richard seemed to immerse himself in his projects out in the garage. Margaret could hear his cement mixer running at all hours, day and night. Strangely, she never questioned why there was no fresh concrete appearing anywhere. Meanwhile, the phone rang off the hook as friends in the know expressed concern about the state of her marriage, while those previously unaware pumped her for information. To maintain appearances, Margaret bent the truth. She told people that Richard had always been aware of her arrangement with Thomas and Vanessa, but that he had asked her to abstain that weekend since it had been their anniversary. She claimed she had dishonored his request and that his anger afterward was understandable. Thomas, on the other hand, kept pestering Margaret, asking if Richard was ready to hear his apology. She repeatedly advised him to wait, certain that Richard wasn't ready to forgive or forget. With no intimacy forthcoming from her husband, Margaret sought Vanessa's approval to increase her visits to Thomas's bed to once a week. Vanessa readily agreed, and things continued on that way for 3 weeks. When it came time for Margaret and Richard to host the monthly party, she started putting pressure on him to go through with it. She insisted it was an opportunity to show their friends that everything was back to normal and that their social circle could continue without interruption. She emphasized how unfair it was for someone of their friends to still feel uncomfortable about events that didn't even concern them. For the first time in weeks, Margaret saw an emotional reaction from Richard. He seemed genuinely excited, and she was relieved, thinking he was finally excited, ready to move on. The monthly parties were always scheduled for the last Saturday of the month, so it struck her as unusual when 2 couples declined, citing prior engagements. Still, Margaret was relieved that both belonged to the previously unaware group, which meant less need for creative storytelling. Everyone else showed up, and the party started off well. But then, 30 minutes in, one of the previously unaware couples abruptly left, claiming something had come up. 20 minutes later, another couple followed suit. Suspicious, Margaret began paying closer attention to the interactions in the room. The atmosphere had shifted noticeably, and the dwindling guest list didn't fully explain the tension. From across the room, she watched Richard speaking with Patricia and Jerry, his expression intense and their faces downcast as they listened. After a few moments, Richard shook his head and moved on. Curious, Margaret trailed him as he approached Sandra and Bo. This time, his serious demeanor was met with animated conversation and vigorous head-shaking. 5 minutes later, Sandra and Bob approached Margaret, bid her good night, and promptly left. To say Margaret was furious would be an understatement. What gave Richard the right to drive their friends away and humiliate her like this? She stormed into the kitchen, determined to confront him. Thomas, noticing her thunderous expression, ignored her earlier warnings to steer clear of Richard and followed her inside. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "You're upsetting our friends, embarrassing me." Richard turned to her with a calm, almost unsettling tone. "I'm sorry, dear. I've just been figuring out who among them are innocent and who were conspirators." Thomas, I'm glad you're here. In the spirit of fairness and out of respect for our years of friendship, I think you should know I'm heading to the basement now to retrieve my pistol from the safe. When I come back, I'm going to shoot you both. With that, Richard turned and calmly walked out of the room. Thomas instinctively reached for his arm, but Margaret held him back. "Come on, Thomas, we need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "You can't be serious, Margaret," Thomas replied. "He's just trying to scare us. Get a little payback. He won't actually do it." Margaret shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't see his eyes, Thomas. Richard has green eyes. Whatever I just saw wasn't Richard. Those were black eyes, the eyes of AIs. Monster. We created that monster, and we need to leave now. But what about Vanessa? Thomas asked. Forget her, Margaret snapped. She's not in danger. It's us he's after. That was all Margaret could remember before her thoughts returned to the television, her attention drawn back to the droning voice. To all the family and friends of those who once called themselves my friends, but never alerted me to my wife's betrayal, my deepest apologies. I hope I've sent a message to society that such unacceptable behavior deserves consequences with the help of the failed media. Perhaps this lesson will linger for years. At the very least, these vile individuals have been removed from the gene pool. And finally, to my former friend Thomas, 35 days after me, you'll learn the same lesson I did. I created a situation where the one thing worse than death became a reality. Losing someone you've loved unconditionally for so long in such a brutal, unexpected way is far worse than dying. It's like having your heart ripped from your chest, only for someone to stomp on it and laugh while it's still beating. As I told your cheating wife, good luck explaining this to your children. Try telling them why their mother is gone, knowing they'll look at you and believe it's all your fault. Your kids learn the same lesson I'm teaching mine, what it means to see how a real man faces death, and good luck explaining yourself to everyone else. Family, friends, neighbors may decide Vanessa got off easy, but I don't envy her. There's a fate worse than death, living with the endless regret of the pain you've caused to so many. Goodbye, my old friend. I'll see you in hell. Margaret drifted into unconsciousness again, but her mind was far from peaceful. Memories she had tried to suppress burst vividly into focus. She remembered dragging Thomas out of the front door, the deadbolt clicking behind her as she forced him to run. Reaching the other side of the street, she had glanced back just once to see Richard standing at the window, staring at her with an eerie calm. And then, it happened. The explosion. The sheer force of it knocked both her and Thomas to the ground. Before the pain and shock overtook her completely, she had the presence of mind to drag Thomas under a nearby truck, seeking shelter from the falling debris. The concussive blast wave had stolen her consciousness, but the pain of that moment had embedded itself deep in her memory. When she came to, she was back in the hospital, and the television carried on with its grim updates. Now for today's top story. A house in Mort Crater was destroyed earlier in an enormous explosion. 2 individuals outside the house were injured but are reportedly in satisfactory condition. A police spokesperson confirmed that at least 8 people were inside the house and are presumed dead. This station has learned the house belonged to Richard Wilson, a shot firer at the local mine. More details will lure at the local mine follow as they become available. Margaret closed her eyes, hoping for the relief of oblivion. But the flashbacks return, vivid and haunting. She recalled Richard's calm voice from years ago, explaining the basics of explosives to her. It's just a mix of garden fertilizer and fuel, gasoline, kerosene, something like that, he has said. She'd asked if it was easy to make, and his response was matter of fact. It's simple. You just need to mix it roughly, my baby, with something like a cement mixer, then set it off with a detonator and a booster. The memory of his words played over and over, colliding with another horrific image. She saw him again at the window in her mind's eye. In his left hand, a small yellow box dangled with wires trailing from it. Behind him, 7 faces stared out, their expressions a mix of fear and disbelief. Their gazes darted between the box in Richard's hand and the fleeing couple outside. In slow motion, she saw motion. She saw Richard's green eyes glimmer as his face broke into a twisted smile. Then he raised the box, pressing a button with deliberate precision. The explosion consumed her memory once more, and a merciful darkness finally began to descend. 2 months later, the television reported yet another grim update. Tonight at 10:00, in our regular public information segment, we were scheduled to bring you an update on Thomas Weston, the lover in the infamous Wilson-Weston tragedy. However, due to his tragic suicide earlier this week, that segment has been canceled. Instead, we'll air an exclusive interview with Emily Martin, eldest daughter of Mary and Stephen Martin, 2 of the victims of the Mort Crater explosion. We'll also provide a report on the overwhelming surge of confession stories, divorces, and counseling requests that have swept the country since the incident. According to the ACP, the current waiting list for marriage counseling services has extended to 3 months.